Hello, this is Professor Hasselman, History 105, and today we're going to be talking about the descent of man and the rise of woman in this time period from 1830 to 1890. So, for all the problems it created, the technological advances of the Industrial Revolution led to increased faith in science and what has been seen to be its inevitable result, progress. In System of Positive Politics, or Treatise on Sociology, Auguste Comte argued for positivism, the belief that a scientific approach to all human problems and the careful accumulation and quantification of hard facts could produce accurate, positive laws for society. Now, at the end of the 18th century, new geologic findings and the discovery of strange fossils bearing no apparent relation to current animals and plants raised questions about the age of the Earth and how existing species came to be. Now, a number of scientists offered preliminary answers along evolutionary lines. Now, Charles Lyell established the modern science of geology, publishing the Principles of Geology in 11 revised editions between 1830 and 1870. James Hutton argued that, contrary to the 6,000-year time frame established by Bishop James Ussher, the Earth was immeasurably old. And Jean-Baptiste Lamarck developed an early theory of evolution in his zoological philosophy and the natural history of animals without backbones. Now, Charles Darwin put it all together. Trained as an MD and clergyman in 1831 through 36, Darwin signed on as the ship's botanist on the scientific expedition of the HMS Beagle to the South American coast. He was intrigued by the slight differences in living specimens between habitats and from the fossils he collected. To explain these variations, he posited the theory of evolution by natural selection. Scientists had believed in evolution for a half a century. What was new in Darwin's suggestion, following Malthus's essay on population, that all nature was engaged in a great competition for survival. The winners of the competition would be those species, for examples of a species that were better fitted to that environment, the acquisition of food and other factors, survival of the fittest. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his findings in The Origin of Species. Now, Darwin's ideas were rapidly accepted in the scientific world because they explained so much. They caused controversy, though, in the wider world because they seemed to deny both the veracity of the biblical account of creation and agency for God in the natural world. Now, some thinkers, known as social Darwinists, applied the idea of natural selection and the survival of the fittest to humanity, concluding that history was the struggle of the strong against the weak for command of the Earth's resources. In the view of social Darwinists, the civilized, the powerful, and the wealthy were so because they were best fitted to win the struggle of human life. The uncivilized, powerless, and poor were nature's losers. Thus, Darwin and the theory of natural selection were used to justify racism, imperialism, classism, and even sexism. Now, most controversial of all was the implication articulated in The Descent of Man, that if all nature evolved from a primitive state, surely so did man, and in Darwin's analysis, from apes. Now, Gregor Mendel, an Augustinian monk from Brno, Czechoslovakia, asked how Darwin's useful traits are passed on to the next generation. Now, building on the work of 18th century taxonomists, Mendel studied 28,000 pea plants for heredity and revolution. These experiments led to the idea of genetic inheritance, inheritance by means of genes. And he published his work in 1866, but it made little impact until after 1900. Far more immediately important to physical medicine were the discoveries of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Louis Pasteur was professor of chemistry at the University of Lille. He studied the process of fermentation and identified microorganisms, or bacteria, that sour wine. He also came to understand how milk sours, developing the idea of pasteurization to kill bacteria. His work led to the germ theory of disease. Now, mocked at first, Pasteur's theories were gradually proved to be by his experiments on anthrax, rabies, septicemia, cholera, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and smallpox. Robert Koch developed these ideas even further. In the 1870s, he isolated the disease-causing agent in anthrax, thus demonstrating that Pasteur was right. He developed techniques for working with infectious agents and infectious wounds, explaining how tetanus worked. And in 1882, he announced the isolation of the bacteria causing tuberculosis. Now, the period also saw new medical treatments and techniques. Surgical anesthesia was introduced in the 1840s. Joseph Lister developed antiseptics in 1865. And at the end of the century, Röntgen developed X-rays. Now, questions about man's rank in the universe, along with women's increasing role in the workplace, contributed to a similar debate about gender. Feminism was not a new idea. European history is full of writers who had questioned the subordinate place of women. But the key figure in forcing the Enlightenment to confront feminism was Mary Wollstonecraft, who published A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. She condemned the state of servile ignorance into which most women were consigned, and she asked, in Enlightenment fashion, why women should not be free to exercise their non-biological talents as men did. John Stuart Mill extended these ideas in On the Subjection of Women. George Sand, Amandine A.L.D. Dudevant, dressed in men's clothes, engaged in a series of affairs with prominent intellectuals, and wrote novels, letters, and memoirs, all celebrating her unconventional lifestyle. Early socialists, including Saint-Simon and Engels, also embraced the notion of female equality. Now, during the 19th century, public education was extended and made mandatory for women in France and in England. But professional opportunities for women were limited because reformers passed laws restricting the work women could do on the grounds of protecting them and preserving jobs for men. Still, women were becoming a more common sight in the factory, and then other fields associated with single women included teaching and secretarial work. Now, perhaps the most important advances made in the 19th century were the areas of sex, marriage, and divorce. Now, in most European countries, women were viewed as property and could not own their own property if married. They had no rights of divorce, there was no reconciliation or recognition of the possibility of marital rape. Birth control was even illegal. In England, Caroline Norton campaigned for the right of women to initiate divorce proceedings. And Josephine Butler fought laws that discriminated against prostitutes, yet made no attempt to punish their male clients. Annie Besant campaigned for the right to distribute information on birth control. And in the Netherlands, Alida Jacobs established the first birth control clinic in the 1880s. During the 19th century, women's suffrage was really only an issue in those countries where men had first achieved the vote, especially England and the United States. By the end of the century, two approaches to the issue had emerged. The National Society for Women's Suffrage urged persuasion and peaceful protest, and the Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, urged violence if necessary. Now, evolution, feminism, Marxism, Romanticism, and liberalism all fed into this scintillating intellectual life of the 19th century Europe. The arts were dominated by Romanticism and reactions to it. But increasingly faced with the squalor of agricultural and working class life, artists reacted against the idea of romantic hero and embraced realism and naturalism. In literature, Balzac, Flaubert, Zola, Dickens, Eliot, Hardy, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Ibsen, among many others, took on very controversial social topics, including working conditions, poverty, divorce, and belief. Painters such as Courbet and Millet depicted agriculture and working class life more realistically. The same could be said of the new technique of photography. In music, realism manifested itself in the operas of Verdi, Leoncavallo, and Puccini. But music also embraced nationalism, traditional stories, and folk terms. From the operas of Wagner to the Hungarian dances of Brahms, the Slavic dances of Dvorak, to the ballets of Tchaikovsky. Now, the emphasis on reason and science may also be seen in a renewed interest in history based on primary evidence. Now, associated with all these movements and beliefs was a growing secularism. In England, the Church of England remained established, but there was a growing culture of doubt. In France, the Church had never recovered the position lost in the French Revolution. In Germany, Bismarck launched a full-scale Kulturkampf, or culture war, against the Roman Catholic Church. Overall, church attendance declined for workers and peasants, and many urban Jews became secularized. Now, as we saw in the case of evolution, conservatives bewailed those developments. The Roman Catholic Church especially mounted an active resistance to modern trends. In 1864, Pope Pius IX issued the Syllabus of Errors, condemning virtually the whole of modern civilization. In 1870, the First Vatican Council approved the doctrine of papal infallibility. But in 1878, a new pope, Leo XIII, began the process whereby the Church has come to terms with modernity. Perhaps the earlier pope's hostility to modernity is understandable. He was one of many European rulers who lost power as a result of one of its hallmarks, nationalism, which we will discuss in the next few lectures.